Well, good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's episode of Automation Hour. We're thrilled that you're here to join us again for today's episode. So as usual, before we jump into the content, we'll go through a little bit of housekeeping. So Daryl, if you want to go to the next slide. Just a reminder, we have everybody on mute. However, we love the interaction with the audience, so please feel free to post your questions, comments, thoughts, even opinions. You can use either the question widget here in GoToWebinar, or of course you can post those in the Automation Hour Trailblazer community as well. We are also recording the session, so once we wrap today, we will get this posted to our YouTube channel. And of course, you can follow us at any of our social media handles to get all the latest information and rewatch our previous episodes. All right, so next up, we want to talk about the great lineup that we've got through 2023. We're into March and starting with our building blocks of flow. This is part 2 of that. Coming up after that, we've got formulas, and then we're going to jump right into building flows. And that'll take us through the first half of the year. And then, of course, the second half of the year, we're going to continue through that. And then also talk about some other pieces of orchestration, automation, and some best practice and migration strategies. So we would be thrilled for you to join us for any of these sessions that make sense to you. And you can register for those at automationhour.com/upcoming webinars. But of course, we cannot bring this to you without our amazing sponsors. So we want to take just a minute to say thank you to them. So first, of course, Concrete.io. They've been with us since the beginning of Automation Hour. So a huge shout out to them and thank you. And of course, we've added a couple of other sponsors in recent time as well. So we want to make sure that we say thank you to our next sponsor. I'm trying to remember what order we have these in. This is why Daryl is a wonderful Vanna White. Thank you. Sumo Scheduler is our second sponsor that we want to say thank you to. And of course, last but not least, our other sponsor is Active Campaign. So again, without them, we could not bring you the series, and so we are incredibly grateful for their support. So, co-hosting today, you have Rakesh and I, but of course you're not here to see us, you're here for our amazing guest presenter. So with that, I am going to turn it over to the very wonderful and very, very early in the morning participant, Daryl. Daryl, I think it's what, 5 a.m. for you?
Correct, but awesome. I am awake.
I'm going to turn it over to you.
Thank you, Michelle. All right, so a little bit about me. You can read that if you're interested, and let's get on to the agenda. Okay, so we've got 5 topics. We have a quick look at the Flow Trigger Explorer. We take a look at paused and failed interviews, where we can find those. There's a built-in report that we can have a look at for flow reports, and that'll give us some details about screen flows. We'll also look at the flow running contacts, how you can use that to elevate the privileges when your flow is running. And finally, we have a look at some settings that we need to make sure that we've configured in Automation Home. Okay, so let's get started with our first topic. So the Flow Trigger Explorer. Now, the reason why we need this is there's been quite a bit of discussion and quite a bit of controversy about should we have one flow per object or should we have multiple flows per object. The advantage of the Flow Trigger Explorer, if you go down the multiple flows per object route, is that you can control the order in which they execute. And that was the whole reason behind having one flow per object, is because you could not guarantee what order they would run in. However, now with Flow Trigger Explorer, we can do that. So when I started, it's showing me by default a contact object, and it's showing me when a contact object record is created, that there are these 4 flows that are running. So there's one fast field update, so that's the before save flow. And you can tell by my reasonably good naming convention that that's going to update the lead source. That flow is active. and it is the only before save flow that's going to run. So we don't have any conflict there. That's the only one that's going to run on the contact before it's saved. However, after save flows, we've got 3 of them. So one is doing an update on the phone number. One is counting contacts for account records, and the other one is checking if there is a missing email field. And you can see that there are none running asynchronously. Now, if I wish to reorder those, obviously the first one makes no sense because there is only one, but in the second one, the related records, we can select the edit order, and we can shuffle those around and change the order. And when we update, it's going to save a new version of that flow. Okay, and it's now done. So simple as that, you can rearrange those to run them in the order that you wish. Besides when the record is created, because some of these flows might be for both created and also for updated, we can have a look and see which ones are also running when the contact record is updated. And you can see that again, we've got 4, but this one's different. We don't have that email one on update, but we've got a flow that is called fail to update. Now that one's deliberately going to fail. Reason for that is when we looked at one of the next topics, the paused and failed interviews, we actually want a flow to fail so that we can see what happens. So again, we've got the before save and the after save flows, and we can do exactly the same thing. We can edit the order of those. And then there's one more, there's also any deleted flows. Okay, so there is no before save on the deletion there. Just back to here, we can also, if the flow is not active, you can actually go and show the status here on the right and deactivate or activate the flow as needed as well. So if you decide, oops, that one shouldn't be running at the moment, you can decide to deactivate it, or you can activate a different version as well. Or alternatively, in the top, you can go and open that flow and make some changes to it as well. Okay, so that's our Flow Trigger Explorer. Obviously, we can select any object on the left here, so we can select the account record, and you can see we've got a before save that's running to update the rating, and we've got another couple of flows here on the right for after save, and this one's not active, so we could look at the details on that and activate that one as well if we wish. Okay, so that's our Flow Trigger Explorer. The aim of it to be able to set the order in which those flows run when we have multiple flows per object. Michelle, do we have any questions coming up about that before we move on to the next one?
I don't see any just yet, so I'd say we can keep going.
All right. Okay, so what happens when a flow fails? Well, we've all seen that horrible message that the user gets, and you've seen the email that's sent to the administrator if you've got things configured correctly. But there's also those flows that may be paused as well. So where do we see those? How do we go and look and see which flows are either in that failed or paused state? So from our process automation submenu in setup, we've got paused and failed flow interviews. Okay, and so when we go into it, we've got different list views that you can configure. So I split them out so that I've got all the failed ones together and paused ones. So I've separated those out. We can look at all of them together in one, or you can just simply look at, okay, which ones are failed, and that's just by filtering on here. Okay, so if we look at failed flow interviews, we can see that there's a flow here called contact fail to update. That has failed twice, and I can open that on the right hand side menu option there, and you get the same screen here as what you would do in that email that's sent to your administrator when your fail flows. Other way around, when your flow fails. Okay, so you can see here that this update has failed. It's failed because I tried to put XXXX as the ID for the account ID. That was deliberate, just to make sure that we had something to show you here under failed flows. If I go back, so any flow that fails will appear in there. We go back to that list view, and once you've resolved that, you can delete that message from here as well. Okay, so as an administrator, it's important that you keep an eye on those. Maybe you have multiple administrators on your org, so it's important to go back from time to time and keep track of those, delete them when they've been resolved, keep things nice and tidy. If, however, we have a paused flow, then they will appear here in this filtered list view of all paused flow interviews. And you can see that I've got a flow called Create One Contact. It's a screen flow. And I've deliberately put a pause in it for 7 days. So it's sitting there waiting to resume again on the 29th of March. Okay, so it's still got a few days to go yet. So it will sit there waiting until that time comes up, and then it will disappear. Alternatively, you can delete that and remove that from there as well. Now, one interesting thing I did find is there was a built-in lead orchestration. So this is a flow orchestration that I think came by default with the org, because I didn't create it, or maybe I did and forgot. And there doesn't seem to be any option to remove that. So I don't know how orchestration, I'll be watching Automation Hour later in the year to see a bit more about orchestration and see how and why we can't delete those out of paused interviews. Okay, so any of those flows that have got something that's going to run in the future or have been paused will appear there. Okay, how are we going on questions? Michelle, we still anything?
We have a couple.
Oh, awesome.
So, and this may need to go back to where we were before, but Namdi had asked, can we move the order in which the flows appear, which I'm guessing may have been a question about Orchestrator. And right. I think Ashley was asking about the same thing. Ashley said, is there a place to track versions of flows after you've changed them? Is that like where you were showing that you could activate or deactivate them?
Okay. All right, so reordering them was here. So we're now looking at a count. So this one's a little bit different, but because we've only got the 2 of them, but edit order. And then on the left-hand side, you get these little dots open up and you can pick them up and drag them to change that order, and you can see it's changed to italic until we update that. And we hit update, and now the order of those has changed.
Yep. And then
I wonder whether that question actually was about the actual list view of the flow, Michelle. I wonder whether that was about this, because you can change this as well now. So you do have the option to select the fields that you want to display in your flow. And of course, you can sort this by label or API name or type of process as well. And there's a couple of other fields that I often use in there. Yeah, I added the trigger one because that's quite helpful, because I often see people in their flow naming convention wanting to put something to say, well, this one runs after save, or it's a scheduled flow or something. And I think, why? You don't need to do that. You can, add that trigger field and it's there. So it shows you down here that this one here called shed one is a scheduled flow. This one's a record run before save flow. So that field is quite useful, and that's just a matter of selecting the fields to display on your flow list view. And yeah, that one's called trigger, so that's quite useful. And back to the second question was about the version numbers. If we select one of these flows and we look at our flow details and versions, we do have the different version numbers of that flow. So this one's only got 2 versions, and we can activate either one of those in exactly the same way as if we open that flow and we did oh, I'm in the wrong place. Let me go back one step. I'm just trying to pick one that's got, if I sort them by date, I just want to pick one that's got a few versions on it, that's all. Okay, so if we view the details and versions here, so we've now got visibility of our versions, and we can activate whichever one that we require. Okay, so 2 different places that you can basically do the same thing. So you can do it from within the Flow Trigger Explorer, or you can do it by right-click selecting on view the details of the flow, and you can activate whichever version that you want there, or you can delete it. If you want to delete a flow completely, you just got to make sure that there are no versions active, and then you can use the delete button up the top here, and that will delete all versions, or individually you can select down here the particular version that you wish to delete.
So Daryl, why would you want to delete versions of your flow?
Because you might have hit the limit of 50 versions, so you can only have 50 at a maximum. And the way that I develop particularly complex flows is I just do little bit by little bit. So I'll build a little piece and I'll save it and I'll activate it and I'll test that. And then I'll go back and I'll add a little bit more. And sometimes I do hit that limit, and then I have to manually go through and delete all of the other versions of it. I probably shouldn't activate it. I probably should just jump straight to debug. But sometimes it might be over, several weeks that I'm developing that flow, and I do tend to activate when I've sort of got to a point where I think, well, that part of it's working, I need to move on.
Perfect. So Stephen apparently saw your quadruple X there in your example and wants to know if you have beer on the mind this early in the morning over there.
Oh, he knows about our local Forex beer, does he?
Does
No, not
indeed.
at all. Not at all. Yeah. So there is a joke that why do they spell beer with 4 X's in Queensland? And that's because they can't spell beer. But anyway, no, it's a bit early in the morning for me for beer.
Perfect. I think we've got everything answered that fits right now. So if you want to keep going, we'll keep gathering questions.
Okay, so we're just going to go back to our sales app and have a look at reporting on flows. Now, by default, there is a report type for flows. And if I can find reports, I've hidden them down here somewhere. Oh, there we are. And there is a sample report that lives in the public reports folder. Okay, so if you go to public reports, you should have a sample report there. If not, you can simply create one as well. Now, what this allows us to do is basically see the results of our running screen flows. It only seems to work with screen flows. I didn't really dig into it deeply to see whether it couldn't report on other types of flows, but I know just from reading the Salesforce help document that it was mainly focused around screen flows. And like me, Salesforce a little bit slow this morning. Let's give it a hurry up. Here we go. Okay. So I've customized this a little bit and just added the graph in there. But aside from that, I didn't get all of the report. Let's try that again. Sometimes my internet connection's a little bit clunky. Here we go. So I've grouped this by the flow name and the status. Okay, now just one thing to explain here. When we talk about a flow interview, what that means is an instance of that flow or a run of that flow. Okay, so given that, you know, we've got a flow here called test get address, that's been run several times by different users. Okay, so you can see, although these were all run at the same time, if we look at this lead quick create, you can see this was run on the 22nd, on the 2nd of March, sorry if my dates are back to front for you, and again on the 26th of February. Okay, so each one of those is an instance where a user has run that flow, and these are screen flows, so they've obviously clicked a button to actually run that flow. So that's what the instance is, or the interview, same thing, instance, interview, a run of the flow means basically the same thing. Interesting looking at this one here on the quick create of the lead, that we've got different versions, and you can see that on the earlier version it was a little bit slower, so it looks like maybe I've done something to improve the performance of that, because subsequent runs after that of version 2 was significantly quicker. Now there is no difference between this interview here for 0.42 of a second, 0.32 or 0.35. It just depends on what the load is on Salesforce at that time, because this is basically, I've filled in a web lead, a little quick action for create a lead, and this is basically that save time from when I've hit next to actually save the record and finish it. Okay, so they're pretty similar, but you can notice that it's a little bit faster. So if you've built a screen flow, you've created a new version, then this is quite useful to show, have you actually improved the performance of it? So we've not only got the version, different log entry types occur. So you can see that the flow has started, this one finished. The second one has got a start and it's got a next and then a finished. Okay, so it's obviously got a second screen in there. What else can we see there? We can see the actual timestamp of when it started and who it was run by as well. Okay, so there's not much more in the way of fields within that report that you can get anything useful in. Namespace, if it's part of a managed package, might be useful. Creator date is just the creator date of those actual of the interview, so that run of the flow, which is going to be pretty much the same as the timestamp that we've got over here. So this report is based on a report type that uses the object flow interview logs, and it has a child as well, flow interview log entries. Okay, so there is a log and then there are log entries, and that's where the majority of the fields have come from out of this log entries. Okay, so that's quite a useful one to manage your screen flows, see how long they're taking. Also just to see, how many times, and you could group that by month, for example, or group that by week, and you can see how many times that users have been using a particular flow. Okay, so all about flow reports. Any questions, Michelle, before we move on to the next topic?
Nope, I think we're okay for now.
Okay, I could just show the report type for that one. So if I look up report types, this one here. So yeah, it was automatically created, that one, so you should have that in an org. If we have a look at that, so you can see there are two objects in there. As I mentioned, it's got the flow interview logs and then records from the log entries, and we can look at the layout for that and see all of the different fields. And you can see this one, custom report, is automatically generated, so system created that one for us. So here's the actual log file, and then the entries down here on the bottom section. Okay, so that's the report type that report is utilizing. Okay, next one, looking at the flow running context. Flow running context. Right, okay. So sometimes you want a flow to run and provide the user some additional access that they may not have before. Now, where could this occur? Perhaps users cannot normally create account records. Maybe you have another part of the business that does that. But the user is creating a new contact record, and for that contact, they need an associated account, which doesn't exist at the moment, and which they don't have permission. So you're kind of stuck in a bit of a catch-22 situation. So what you can do there is you could create a subflow that creates that account, and you can escalate the permissions of that subflow so that it can create the account record. So when they go through and they're creating their contact and they need to create the associated account with it, that subflow will run as admin, got all the permissions it needs, can create that account, so it comes back, and then they can continue creating their flow, their contact record. So how that works is, let me just sort these. We'll just pull out a flow. This one will do. Okay, so when we go to save the flow, if we go down here to show advanced, and we scroll a little bit further,
I don't think this one shows on record triggered. I think it's got to be an auto launched.
You're right. Good pickup. Thank you, Michelle. Okay, here's a screen flow. Let's do this one. Yes, and there are certain orders in which they can, or certain types of flows which you can and can't do this in it, and that's a good point. On the record triggered flows, they will normally run as the running user, and you can't change that. Okay, but let's have a look at this screen flow, and we show advanced, and here we are. How to run the flow. Okay, so by default, how the flow is launched determines whether it runs in the context of the user or the system. Okay, so we've got quite a few choices here. So we've got user or system context, which is basically the default. So in the example that I talked about where they needed to create an account record, but they didn't normally have access to that, if we were configuring that subflow now, that is going to be able to create the account record, we would choose one of these two options. So system context with sharing. So it will enforce the sharing settings. Okay, so it will obey the profile settings and also sharing settings as well for those records, or you can go to system context without sharing, so it ignores all of the sharing rules, still obeys the profile, which in this case, because it's running in system context, will be the administrator profile. So this is basically your God mode. Okay, so if you want to absolutely make sure that they can definitely create it, don't care about any of those things, you would select the access all data. Okay, so sharing rules, so whether they be custom sharing rules or sharing based from Apex or any other method of sharing, territory, sharing rules, any of those, or you can simply ignore all of those and just access all data. Okay, so that's how you can run a flow basically as admin. Okay, I would say use this with caution, and where you do need to have a function that needs to utilize that, separate that function out into a subflow. Okay, so that the majority of your flow runs in normal user mode and is restricted by and controlled by the new normal restrictions around that user's profile and their sharing settings, and then just elevate it in a subflow where you need to. Okay, basically limit the damage that could be done. Okay.
All right, so I think we have a question that goes back to the report types that we talked about.
Yes.
So you had shown the report type, and this one is for screen flows. So is the report type that you showed us only available for screen flows, or is there a way to run reports on other types of flows, say record triggered flows?
That's a question. That's a good question, and one I don't have an answer for. So I'm not sure. I was looking at the help looking at the help document for that, let me just pull that up. It only mentions screen flows. So there was a help document. That only mentions screen flows. So I'm not sure whether other types of flows create those log entries. Perhaps they don't.
So from what I am seeing, it looks like maybe is the best answer we have at this point. Because they definitely mention analyzing screen flows.
I'm on the wrong
They
link.
say you can use the flow interview log and the flow interview log entries objects, but it doesn't specifically say that those also are available for non-screen flows. So I think probably my best suggestion would be to build a report and see what it shows you, and then report back so we can share with the rest of the community.
Absolutely. There was that help document for what contexts the flows run in as well. So it does depend a bit on what method the flow was launched. So if you're launching from an Experience Cloud site, then the default is going to run in user mode. Okay, so it does depend. So we're talking about the default here if you don't change it. So the default, if your flow is running in an Experience Cloud, is going to run in user mode. Okay, so it all depends on how it actually runs. Scheduled triggered is a bit different. It runs in system context without sharing, because of course it doesn't have a user sitting there in front of the keyboard running the flow. Okay, it's running at a particular time schedule. The record triggered flows by default also run in system context without sharing as well, because I guess that's because it is presumed that the user who triggered the flow had the correct permissions to be able to do whatever it was necessary to be able to cause that trigger to fire, and then the system takes over and runs that record triggered flow. So that's why when we looked at that flow, the first one, and I tried to set the context that it wasn't available because it was already going to be running in system context without the sharing. Okay, on to the last topic.
We got one other question real quick on reporting.
Yes.
Upton had asked, why is the interview start timestamp and the end timestamp always the same?
Because, okay, let's just, basically because the start and end time are in minutes, and the duration, as you can see, is very short. So this one started and ended basically on the same minute. So this one here ran for 0.01 of a minute. So it started at 8:11 and 27 seconds, and then finished at 8:11 and 28 seconds. So that's why. And unless your screen flow has multiple screens that they're going through next, and takes them a couple of minutes, then often that start and end time is going to be pretty much the same, unless you have a long multi-complex multi-screen flow.
Perfect. All right. So I think we've got all the questions for now. Yeah.
Awesome. Okay. Right, so one more thing that we need to have a look at is there are some settings that we should sort out before we start running a whole bunch of flows. And they live in here. There's two parts. Automation Home is a new beta feature that has come out recently. Doesn't do a whole lot yet, but it looks promising. So this is, the aim of this is to be your home page of what's happening in your flow environment, basically. Okay, so we can see in the last 30 days, we can see paused flow interviews. There were 23 of them that occurred in the last, but it doesn't let you click into it and do anything. Total number of flows without user interface. Okay, so these will be your scheduled and your record triggered flows, everything but the screen flows. And that's in the last 30 days. And also, it's interesting, those numbers don't add up. The peak number of they were paused, okay. So here's our total number of flows without. So these are the background ones, and then these are the screen flow ones. Okay, so it's all around the last 30 days. Not configurable at this stage, nothing much more you can do but look at the numbers. The next section is about sort of some resources and things to get you started with flow or to help you on your journey. So there's a whole bunch of useful templates on the App Exchange that you can look at here. The second one points you to a bunch of resources in Salesforce documentation. There's some webinars, there's some Trailhead content and so forth as well, and some good documentation there. Third one takes you on to Trailhead in filtered by flow. And there's a whole bunch of new, if you haven't seen them already, there's a whole bunch of new super badges for flow that even I haven't finished them all yet, because they've been quite prolific in punching those out over the last few weeks. And finally, there's another section where you can connect with the Trailblazer community groups as well, focused around flow. So it's starting to look useful. And then, and I don't know why most of this is blank, because it tells me there is no data, but we know that we've run some screen flows. For some reason, it thinks maybe that those screen flows didn't finish. I'm not sure. So there'll be, a bit of a dashboard with some other graphics down the bottom here as well. Okay, so yeah, nice start. You can create a flow from there as well, or a next best action, or an approval process as well. So it looks like this is destined to become sort of the starting point for flow. But, it's only beta, so there's a little bit of work to go on there yet. Okay, finally, the other section I wanted to look at is to take a look at process automation settings, and what you should have configured here and what everything means. Excuse me. Okay, now don't be confused by the name, the workflow user, because this is sort of a hang around from the old workflows, but it is also used for flows as well. So make sure that you've got somebody configured in here, because if your flow is triggered by some user who's no longer active, then the default workflow user basically picks this up. Okay, and the default workflow is also the user who runs your scheduled triggered flows. So this probably should be yourself if you're the admin. And it's useful to associate that with an email address as well. Okay, the next one is just around approval processes. So Don't really care about that when we're just talking about flow. Okay, so the next ones are very flow specific. If you want users to be able to pause flows, so maybe you've got a long complex flow, maybe it's you've got a customer support role and they're using a flow to like a wizard that handles the query from the customer, and they've sort of got to a point where the customer's got to go off and get some further information and come back to them, then maybe they want to pause that flow and be able to come back to it later. So you can opt to allow or not allow users to pause flows there. And if you're going to allow them to pause them, it makes sense that in the second option, you'll also allow to resume them as well. So your choice whether or not you want to do that, but if you do, you probably want to tick both of those. The next one, the lightning runtime for flows, this by default I think would always be on. You definitely want that on so that your flows run in a lightning environment and not in a Visual Force sort of looking environment that looks a bit more like classic. So you definitely want that turned on. When we were looking at that automation home screen before, to be able to view those charts. So if you want other users outside of your administrators to be able to look at those charts, then you may want to turn that on. Okay, so they need to have managed flow permissions to be able to look at those charts. Yeah. Okay, this one's useful, and this is where you saw me looking earlier at the paused and scheduled automations. Yeah, so definitely want to turn this one on. So it gives you, yes, so this one separates those paused and failed interviews for you into separate list views. So you definitely want to turn that on. The next one is about, don't know, ticket. If in doubt, ticket. Allow Apex to set and remove process locks. Yeah, don't really care too much about that one. The next one, it could be useful. Let admins debug flows as other users. So in some of your flows, when you go to debug, you do have the option to debug it as another user. So only if this is turned on. Okay, so you want to turn that on, because it might be that when the user runs the flow, it doesn't work, but when you go in and run it, and it works perfectly, well, of course, because you've got admin rights. So to be able to run it as the other user with their permissions in debug mode is a useful technique. Then you can see exactly what's going on. And then finally, this is about the email error that you get when a flow fails. Now, you've got the choice, and the default is this one, which you probably don't want. Reason being is if the user who last modified the flow is no longer at your company, where's the email going to go? You ain't going to get it. Okay, so you probably want to set it to that Apex exception email recipients, and then go to your Apex exception email recipients and set it. This one here, Apex exception email. And the advantage here is if you have multiple users, multiple admins on your site, you can add them. Okay, so if there's Daryl and there's Fred and there's Mary and there's Harry, I can add them all in there and they will all get that email when that flow fails. That way, if somebody's away, we don't miss it. The other advantage too is if you have an external service provider, maybe a managed service provider with an external email address outside of Salesforce, you can include them in there as well. Okay, so that one is really important and really useful to set. I would probably turn that on as well. Tick this one. Enable the lightning flow. And the last two, whether or not you allow users to pause and resume flows, is really a company choice, I suppose. And make sure that you've got a current active user in there as your default workflow user. Okay, so if you've done all those things, so you've set your process automation settings right, you've got your flow context set correctly, you're using those reports for your screen flows, you're taking a look at your paused and failed interviews, the logs that are created for those, and you're using your Flow Trigger Explorer to be able to set the order in which your triggered flows run, then you're in a pretty good position to power on and start building some really awesome flows. I'll hand back to Michelle to see if we have any further questions before we wrap up.
So we have a couple. So we've got a couple of people who are chiming in asking why they don't see the let admins debug as other users setting checkbox that you mentioned.
Good question.
So I'm going to throw a help article in chat here. And I think Sarah had a good call out that this is probably only available in a sandbox. So if you're looking for it in prod, that could be why. There's also a few permissions that you need.
That's
so
a good
that
point.
could be why.
Yeah,
but I threw in chat the help article that details that out. So hopefully that will help for anyone who is experiencing some challenges with that.
Okay, good call. So this is a developer org, so which is basically like a mini prod org, really. Anyway, interesting. Sort of raises the question: would you want admins to be able to debug the flow in prod as another user? That kind of sounds like the only place where you probably would do it. You know, you get a phone call from a user who's using the flow and something's not right. It's probably more likely to occur in a production environment. Interesting.
So Kathy chimed in that it may be if the admins can log in as other user setting is disabled, you also may not be able to debug flows as other users as well. So
true, and that's under user interface, isn't it, Michelle?
And that's interesting because I know I have that enabled in pretty much every org I've ever been in. So I don't think I've ever thought about the implications of not having that turned on.
Is it here somewhere? It used to be here. Maybe they moved it. Okay, next question.
So Andrea said that the automated process user email address, adding an email address there is throwing an error for them. If I remember correctly, are there specific types of addresses that can be used there?
Yes, and do you have to validate it first? Don't you, when you create it, it sends out an email and you have to reply to that to activate that email address, pretty sure.
Yep. Yes, it has to be an org-wide email address, and I think it has to be verified first.
Verified is the word, yes.
Yep. I think it has to be valid as an org-wide email address. And I think that'll probably take care of that, because Ksenia had asked, are there any disadvantages to setting the default workflow user to a non-human user, like an integration user or a user whose email address is a shared inbox that multiple users have access to? So is there any caution why you would not do that?
I can't see it, because as long as the user that you set it to like has a fairly high level of permissions, and as long as there is an email address associated with it, and I can kind of see where she's coming from, I think, in that you could set once and forget, as long as you kept the list of people who were receiving those emails up to date, obviously, rather than naming an individual person. And of course, as we know, as years go by, the admin may change, and if somebody forgets to change that setting, then that becomes a problem. So yeah, that sounds like a good move. Yep.
Perfect. Okay, so I have one other question that I've been holding on. So Ruth had said this is a bit off topic, but the question is, I'm trying to figure out how to get a set of random records for auditing. So for example, I need to get 15% of all application records, and that needs to be random. So any thoughts on whether that's something Flow could do?
Now, I've done something similar with the random number. Okay, for starters, you're going to need a random number generator of some sort to be able to generate those random records. And there is one at unofficialsf.com. So if you go hunt around in there, you'll find a random number generator. What you'll then need to do is, how do you pick off those random records? What you may need to do is generate a sequential number on each. Like, for example, you want to pick out 15% of account records. So what you might need to do is to create a auto number field on your account records and just number them from 1 through to whatever. And when you create that field, you have the option, when you create an auto generate field, to go and generate the numbers for all of those records in the past that already exist. Okay, so you would say yes to that. Okay, so then you've got accounts, all of your accounts with sequential number from 1 through to 9 million, however many you got. Then you could use that random number generator in the flow to go generate me some random numbers and pick up the account that has that number. So yeah, definitely possible. And I think that would be the solution to work on. So generate as many random numbers as you need, and then go look up those records for those ones.
Awesome. I think if I remember correctly, Pete demonstrated a random number generator flow that he had built. So that would be another option, as well as like the random number component from unofficial SF. So can you do it with Flow? I think you probably can. Might be a little bit more complicated Flow, but this sounds like a great future automation hour episode.
It does, doesn't it? Yes. And I've heard similar questions before, like auditors seem to like that sort of thing. You know, give me 15 account records at random, and I want to go through and check that. I don't know, whatever they want to check. They all weird sorts of ideas sometimes, these auditors, but they you know, they want to check for things like completeness of records. They want to check for things like maybe activities being recorded. You know, if we're talking about opportunities, you know, one would hope that they're looking to see that all of their activities, so the phone calls, the emails and so on, are all recorded against the opportunity, and that the opportunity shows the whole story. One would hope that our auditors are smart enough to be looking for those sort of things. So that's where a set of random records would come in really useful. Great question, and a great little project.
Absolutely. It's always fun to see the questions that come in and the ideas that they spur. So now I just want somebody to go build it so we can all watch it in action. All right, well, let me do one final check of questions on the Trailblazer community, and we'll give everybody just another minute to get their questions into the question widget if anybody has anything further. All right, looks like we may have gotten everything answered. So Daryl, thank you again so much for coming and presenting. I know it's so early on your Saturday morning. But this has been some great information to kind of help you understand more about the flows that we're getting ready to start building, and to sort of understand what some of these settings are that maybe don't make as much sense.
Yes, and I think there's some promise shown there in that that homepage as well, in that, you know, over time that's actually going to be quite a useful thing, our automation homepage. So and yeah, there are some other settings there that we've just been through that are really important to make sure that you've sort of got things right set up in the background. Yeah, so a little bit sort of a less hands-off session today. This is more sort of making sure that all those things in your environment is right, so that when you do build flows and they break, or you need to report on them, or you need to change the context in which they're running on, that you've got all that sort of information. So yeah, sometimes we've got to step back from busy building and making sure that we've got all of that architecture sort of stuff right. So that's what today's session was designed to cover off. And there's an exciting lineup over the next couple of months on getting stuck right into the details of building some of those other flows. And you've got some great presenters lined up, Michelle, so I'm looking forward to those.
Me too, to be honest. So it should be a great lineup. So again, thanks everyone for joining us today. Daryl, thank you so much for coming to present, and we'll see you all on the next Automation Hour episode.
Okay, thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye all.